Hey everyone, welcome back. Or if you're new here, welcome to the channel. Today's video is about something strange, disturbing, and honestly a little hilarious. The weird rules and deadly superstitions that governed everyday life in the Middle Ages. We're talking about a time when people believed your soul could get trapped in a mirror, that a sneeze could open a portal to the underworld, and that a random goat looking at you the wrong way might mean death by morning. Think your daily life is stressful now? You've got indoor plumbing, antibiotics, and Google. Medieval people had holy water, garlic necklaces, and a priest who might accuse you of witchcraft because your bread rose too fast. We worry about algorithms. They worried about demons hiding in the laundry. So, before we begin, and before you get too comfortable, I'm just a nerd who likes history, so it will mean a lot if you like and subscribe to my channel and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from, and what time is it right now where you are? It always amazes me to see people tuning in from all over the world, and I love reading through your comments to see just how global this little corner of weird history has become. Now, let's dive into tonight's journey. The strange rules and deadly superstitions of medieval life. You've just woken up in a time where people genuinely believe that spilling salt could summon Satan, where you can be sentenced to death for having a birthmark in the wrong place, and where a hiccup might mean you're possessed. Welcome to the Middle Ages, a time when rules weren't written by scientists or lawmakers, but by fear, folklore, and superstition passed down through generations like a cursed family heirloom. Your village is small. Dirt streets, wooden houses, and a suspicious number of cats, or no cats at all, depending on whether they've been recently exterminated for being associated with witches. There's no news, no school, no printed laws on a wall. What you have instead is a tangled web of unspoken rules everyone follows, not because they understand them, but because not following them might just get you killed, or worse, cursed. This is a world where life is hard, death is random, and the line between the natural and supernatural is paper thin. People don't sneeze without crossing themselves. They don't walk past a crossroads without muttering a protective charm. And they certainly don't trust a blacksmith who whistles at night. That man might be on friendly terms with the devil. Everything, and I mean everything, has a rule. Some of them sound oddly specific. Never look a sleeping dog in the eye, never wear your boots indoors during Lent, and definitely don't count stars out loud. Others are more ominous. Don't stand at a doorway during an eclipse. Don't let your shadow touch the coffin during a funeral. And never, ever eat bread that fell butter side down. That last one? It's not just gross, it's an omen. And no, people aren't joking. They believe these things with a conviction we now reserve for smoke alarms and traffic signals. Because when plague, famine, and random acts of God are your daily background noise, you start clinging to any logic, no matter how absurd, that gives you a sense of control. You'd think the church would bring order to this madness, but the church only added fuel to the fire. Priests held just as tightly to superstition as peasants did, declaring eclipses as divine warnings and childbirth pain as punishment from God. Want to explain why your crop failed? It wasn't poor soil or bad weather. It was probably your neighbor giving you the evil eye. Or maybe you forgot to sprinkle salt on the doorway at the new moon. Either way, it's your fault for ignoring the rules. But here's the catch. No one ever wrote them all down. Medieval life was like a dangerous game with invisible instructions, constantly shifting penalties, and the stakes were your eternal soul. Break the wrong rule, and you might not just die. You might come back as a restless spirit, wandering the moors in search of redemption or revenge. This was the mental terrain of the average medieval person. Not just survival, superstition survival. navigating a world where faith, fear, and folklore were more binding than any king's decree. You don't just live through the Middle Ages. You tiptoe, you whisper, you obey the rules, even the ones no one understands, because not doing so is simply too dangerous. It's night in the village, and everything is still. Fires have died down, the sky is cloud-covered, and the only sounds are the creaks of timber and distant animal cries. Then, a whistle. Just a quick, careless tune drifting through the dark. Maybe from a boy walking home, or a drunk staggering back from the alehouse. Nothing malicious, nothing loud. But inside the homes? Panic, candles are snuffed, prayers are whispered, doors bolted. Because in the Middle Ages, whistling at night wasn't just annoying, it was an invitation. They believed the night had rules and breaking them had consequences. Whistling, they said, summoned things that didn't belong in daylight. Spirits, witches, demons. The wind might carry your tune farther than you meant it to, and something might answer back. In Northern Europe, whistling was tied to the wild hunt, a ghostly army of riders that swept through the skies looking for souls to claim. In other places, it was said to wake the dead. Some thought whistling opened doorways. Others said it simply annoyed spirits who hated music made by man. But everyone agreed on one thing. You do not do it. Not after dark. If your crops failed after someone broke the silence, if a child fell sick or a cow collapsed, the explanation was easy. The spirits had been disturbed. Someone had summoned misfortune, one sharp note at a time, and the guilt didn't vanish with the sunrise. The villagers remembered who whistled. That person might suddenly find their friends keeping their distance, might find gossip blooming like mold, might find themselves blamed for the next strange noise in the woods. Because no one likes a rule breaker, especially when the rules protect them from the unknown. It didn't matter that there was no proof. In the Middle Ages, fear was the proof. Superstition wasn't random. It was survival logic. Sound could carry evil. Whistling was reckless. And if something terrible happened after you made noise, well, that wasn't a coincidence. That was justice. So if you find yourself alone on a medieval road under a sliver of moonlight, and your footsteps echo too loud, and the shadows seem to stretch just a bit too far, keep your lips sealed. Say nothing, make no sound. Because in this world, silence isn't empty, it's sacred. Mirrors today are harmless, just polished glass reflecting a familiar face. But in the Middle Ages, mirrors weren't trusted, they weren't innocent. They were seen as supernatural objects, windows to the soul, or worse, to something far darker. People believed that when you looked into a mirror, you weren't just seeing your reflection, you were offering a glimpse of your spirit. That connection wasn't just symbolic, it was literal. Mirrors could trap souls. If you stared too long, especially by candlelight, something might stare back. That's why mirrors were feared in moments of transition, especially death. When someone in a household was dying, mirrors were immediately covered. If they weren't, it was believed the soul of the deceased could get caught in the reflection, stuck in the house forever, wandering between surfaces. A ghost not trapped in chains, but in glass. And if a mirror broke during death, that was even worse. A broken mirror was considered a fractured gateway. The soul would be splintered, lost, perhaps even released in the wrong way, freed not to heaven, but to linger in the world, confused and corrupted. The rules didn't stop there. You weren't supposed to look into a mirror at night, especially not by candlelight or during a thunderstorm. Candlelight was believed to make the veil between worlds thinner, and mirrors might become doors rather than windows. In that flickering light, your reflection might blink when you don't, or smile when your mouth is still. And there were stories, so many stories, of people who saw things moving behind them, of reflections that didn't match the person standing in front of the mirror, of villagers who talked to their own image, only to fall ill or mad shortly after. Witches, it was said, used mirrors to cast spells. They didn't need to be near you. All they needed was a piece of glass in your name. With the right incantation, your reflection could be twisted, your luck reversed, your body cursed. Even giving or receiving a mirror as a gift was suspect, especially if it was an old mirror. Mirrors were believed to retain energy, memories of past owners, echoes of previous souls. Taking in an old mirror was like inviting in a stranger, one who never left. So while nobles had mirrors in their halls, peasants kept them small, covered, or avoided altogether. Glass was rare, after all, and polished metal was enough to catch your reflection, and maybe something else. In medieval Europe, the mirror wasn't a beauty tool. It was a portal, a risk, and to many, a trap. Being left-handed in the Middle Ages wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a liability, a mark of suspicion, superstition, and sometimes outright danger. Because to the medieval mind, the left hand wasn't just different, it was wrong. The word sinister comes from the Latin word for left. That wasn't an accident. Leftness was associated with the devil, with chaos, with betrayal. Everything evil or unlucky in medieval belief somehow ended up tied to the left side. If you crossed yourself with your left hand, blasphemy. If you accepted communion with your left, sacrilege. And God help you if you touched a holy relic or book with that cursed appendage. People genuinely feared the left hand's power, not because it was stronger, but because it was unnatural. Children who showed signs of left-handedness were corrected early. If a child picked up a spoon with their left, the spoon was slapped away. If they tried to write with their left, their hand was tied behind their back. Teachers, priests, even parents believed they were protecting the child's soul, not just their handwriting. Medieval art didn't help. In depictions of the Last Judgment, the righteous rose on Christ's right side. The damned fell away on his left. Angels carried souls up on the right. Demons dragged them down on the left. The very image of salvation and damnation was spatially designed to reinforce the message: right is holy, left is doomed. And it didn't stop at religion. In daily life, superstitions piled up. You never entered a home with your left foot. You didn't pass salt with your left hand. You certainly didn't greet someone or swear an oath using it. To do so was to invite bad luck, or worse, suspicion of witchcraft. Because yes, left-handedness was one of many things used to accuse someone of consorting with dark forces. Witches were said to stir their potions with the left. They drew symbols backwards, wrote spells in mirror script, and blessed objects with their left hand, a reversal of the sacred. So, if you were naturally left-handed, you had two choices: hide it or suffer for it, conform or be condemned. Not just by society, but by the spiritual order of the world. The hand you used might decide how people viewed your soul. In a world where every gesture meant something, using the wrong hand wasn't just awkward, it was dangerous. In the Middle Ages, childbirth wasn't a private event filled with warmth and lullabies. It was a battlefield where life, death, and the supernatural all fought for control over a single breath. If you were a woman about to give birth, you weren't just afraid of pain, you were terrified of what might come through with the baby. From the moment labor began, the house turned into a fortress. Doors were locked not to keep people out, but to keep spirits from slipping in. Windows were covered, not for warmth, but to block the gaze of the devil. Sharp objects, knives, scissors, nails, were scattered under the bed or near the threshold to ward off evil. Even iron horseshoes were nailed above doors for protection, because nothing says stay away like rusty metal and a prayer. The midwife wasn't just helping deliver a baby. She was on high alert for omens. A sudden gust of wind, a flickering flame, a dog howling outside, all of it was bad news. Some would say it meant a demon was circling. Others might whisper that the child was already marked by fate. And the baby? Oh, the baby had their own risks. If born with a caul, a thin veil of membrane over their face, they were either destined for greatness or cursed with second sight. If they were born during a thunderstorm, it meant they'd die young or grow into someone with power best left untouched. If the umbilical cord was wrapped around their neck, it meant the child was touched by darkness. Every twitch and cry was interpreted, judged, and recorded as a sign. Once the baby arrived, the rush didn't stop. Baptism had to be immediate. Unbaptized babies were considered vulnerable, not just to illness, but to being taken. Fairies, demons, or witches were always waiting, eager to steal a newborn and leave a changeling in its place, something that looked like a baby but wasn't. So a priest was fetched in a frenzy, water splashed, Latin spoken, names chosen. Speaking of names, this wasn't about picking something cute or unique. You named the baby after a saint. The stronger the saint, the better. Because the name wasn't just a name, it was armor. It was protection against the invisible world, and mothers weren't forgotten. They were considered unclean for days after birth. In some places, they weren't allowed to enter church until they'd gone through a ritual purification. In others, they were kept in dimly lit rooms with charms and holy objects, watched closely, lest the trauma of birth become a doorway for spirits. So when a child survived the first few weeks, and the mother lived to see the sunrise, it wasn't taken for granted. It was whispered thanks. A miracle, forged through pain, prayer, and enough superstition to fill an entire Bible's worth of footnotes. Today, Monday is just the beginning of the work week. A reason to hit snooze, curse your alarm clock, and drag yourself to the nearest caffeine source. But in the Middle Ages, Monday didn't just mean a rough start. It meant something far darker. It was the unofficial, unspoken day of reckoning. The day when suspicions turned into accusations. The day people looked at their neighbors a little too closely. Because in many villages across Europe, Monday was witch hunting day. This wasn't some law passed down from the king. It was a pattern rooted in folklore, fear, and religious rhythm. Sunday was for salvation, mass, penance, prayer. Monday, that was for judgment. After everyone had confessed their sins, it was time to look outward and see who hadn't shown up to church, who didn't kneel deeply enough, who didn't seem quite right. And the logic made sense to them. The moon, associated with madness and magic, ruled Monday. In fact, the word Monday itself comes from Moon's Day. People believed this lunar influence made the day especially potent for revealing those who trafficked with the supernatural. If a witch had been working her craft in secret, Monday would expose her. The moonlight of Sunday night was believed to weaken magical disguises. A glamour might slip. A spell might waver. Monday was when truth cracked through. So, villagers watched. They paid attention to everything. Was someone walking funny? Eyes too red? Seemed too tired for a normal night? Maybe they weren't sleeping. Maybe they'd been flying. In some regions, Monday morning began with quiet observations, but by midday, it could turn into something louder, more dangerous. Whispers gathered like storm clouds. A woman who healed with herbs. A man who lived alone. A child who spoke to animals. None of these things were crimes. But on a Monday, they were enough. And once suspicion took root, the process was quick. Someone might be summoned by the local priest, or questioned by the local bailiff. In some towns, there were self-appointed witch-finders who specialized in turning rumors into trials. They brought with them tests, crude, cruel, and mostly designed to fail. Could the accused recite the Lord's Prayer without stuttering? Could they stand still while a holy relic was pressed against their skin? Did they flinch when touched with blessed water? If not, perhaps they were innocent. If they did, well, what more proof did you need? In more extreme cases, things escalated, a dunking, a weighing, even public searches for the so-called witch's mark, a spot on the body where the devil was believed to have kissed them. Birthmarks, moles, even scars could be twisted into evidence. You weren't just defending your reputation. You were trying to survive a system built on fear and superstition. And because Monday was the beginning of the week, the outcome shaped the days that followed. If no one was accused, the village relaxed. If someone was taken, interrogated, punished, or worse, then fear ruled the rest of the week. No one wanted to be next, so everyone fell in line. In medieval life, the calendar wasn't just about seasons or saints. It was about power. And Monday of all days was a grim reminder that salvation could give way to suspicion in a single sunrise. At first glance, sweeping seems like the most harmless activity imaginable. It's domestic, simple, and, if you're lucky, mildly therapeutic. But in the Middle Ages, sweeping wasn't just about cleaning. It was about cosmic risk. And if you swept after sunset, you weren't just tidying up, you were tempting fate. People believed that sweeping after dark could brush away more than crumbs and dust. It swept out your household's luck, health, and spiritual protection. A clean floor at night could mean an empty pantry tomorrow, or a sick child, or a cow that wouldn't wake up in the morning. Dirt could wait. Fortune couldn't. The superstition was rooted in the sacred nature of daylight. Sunlight meant safety. It was God's light, pure, clarifying, protective. When the sun went down, the veil between the living and spirit worlds was thought to thin. Shadows lengthened. Invisible forces woke. And the broom, simple and innocent by day, became a powerful and dangerous object by night. A broom sweeping the threshold after sunset was said to remove not just physical dirt, but spiritual blessings. You could accidentally sweep away the presence of your ancestors, who watched over the home. Or, worse, you could disturb spirits that were already nearby, resting, waiting, watching. Disrupt them, and they might not leave quietly. For this reason, many households treated brooms with superstition all day long. Brooms were stored bristle up to keep witches from riding them. Some were kept near the hearth as guardians. Others had charms tied to the handle, bits of iron, herbs, or salt, to neutralize their power. But even with precautions, you did not sweep after dark. There were whispers of people who had. A woman whose baby fell ill. A man whose crops failed the next day. A widow who woke to find every pot in her home cracked. These weren't coincidences. At least, not to the medieval mind. They were consequences. The broom had disturbed something sacred, and that disturbance demanded balance. Worse still, sweeping late at night was associated with witchcraft. Witches, according to folklore, didn't just ride brooms. They used them to cast spells, to draw symbols in ash, to sweep out blessings from their enemies' homes. A woman seen sweeping under moonlight wasn't just cleaning, she was casting. That broom wasn't innocent. It was a wand. So, villages watched. If your neighbor was seen sweeping too late, questions were asked. If your livestock suddenly died and someone had swept near your property, suspicions grew. If your bread failed to rise after someone cleaned their threshold under a new moon, well, you see where this is going. In a world ruled by invisible forces, the broom was a symbol of control. But at night it was a loaded weapon. To sweep after sunset wasn't just a superstition, it was a statement. One the village rarely forgave. You know that look. The one that lingers too long. A stare that sends a chill up your spine. Today, it might feel like discomfort or awkwardness. In the Middle Ages, it was much worse. That look could kill. That was the belief behind the evil eye. A glance so powerful, so charged with envy or malice, it could ruin your life with nothing more than a blink. The evil eye wasn't just a metaphor. It was a real, widespread fear that touched every part of medieval life. People believed some individuals, knowingly or not, carried the ability to cause harm just by looking. Crops could wither. Cows could stop producing milk. A child could fall mysteriously ill. A person's fortune could reverse overnight. And all it took was one bad look. It wasn't always about hate. Often, the evil eye was rooted in envy. If someone admired your healthy baby or your thriving garden too openly, that admiration could accidentally curse you. To praise something without offering a blessing was to endanger it. That's why people said "God bless" after complimenting a child or livestock. Not to be polite, but to protect. Some people were feared for having the evil eye by nature. It might be the way their eyes gleamed in low light, or how they stared too directly. Maybe they were born under an unlucky star or had one eye slightly different than the other. Whatever the reason, suspicion clung to them. If misfortune followed them, it wasn't chance, it was them. The result? A constant undercurrent of tension. People avoided prolonged eye contact. Compliments were whispered cautiously. Travelers covered their faces or wore charms pinned to their tunics. Homes were decorated with apotropaic symbols, protective emblems, sometimes shaped like eyes themselves to turn the gaze back. In some regions, tiny iron hands were hung above doorways. In others, herbs like rue and garlic were carried in pouches for protection. Animals weren't safe either. Horses wore beaded harnesses. Cows had woven necklaces. Babies had tiny amulets tied to their wrists, because anything valuable was vulnerable. The worst part? There was no real way to defend yourself. If you were accused of having the evil eye, how could you prove otherwise? You couldn't. You were stuck, feared, blamed, watched, and maybe, eventually, cast out. It wasn't about logic, it was about control. In a world where disasters were constant and explanations were rare, blaming the evil eye gave people a sense of order, a reason, a target. So if you were alive in the Middle Ages and noticed someone giving you a long, silent stare, you didn't wave, you didn't smile. You reached for your charm, muttered a prayer, and hoped your luck hadn't just vanished with their gaze. Holy water, the great spiritual disinfectant of the medieval world. Blessed by a priest, infused with divine power, and believed to repel demons, cleanse sins, and protect your home from all manner of invisible horrors. It was a sacred staple in churches, homes, and rituals. But for something so pure, holy water came with its own set of dark superstitions, and a surprising number of risks. To the medieval mind, holy water wasn't symbolic. It was active. It did things. It had power. A sprinkle on your forehead protected your soul. A splash at the threshold of your home could block evil spirits. A basin by the church door ensured you didn't walk into sacred ground with sin still clinging to your skin like smoke. But that same power made holy water volatile. Mishandle it, and you weren't just being careless, you were courting disaster. It started with where the water came from. Most holy water began as regular spring or well water, then underwent a ritual blessing, usually by a priest during Mass or on feast days. But not all water was treated equally. Water taken from a haunted well or a stream said to run over cursed ground could carry lingering spiritual residue. If such water was used in blessing, even accidentally, it didn't purify. It corrupted. Storage mattered too. Holy water had to be kept in clean, sealed containers. Let it sit too long, and it might go stale, spiritually speaking. Stale, holy water was considered worse than useless. It could attract misfortune. It could invite spirits rather than repel them. Some people believed it would turn if neglected, losing its divine favor and becoming something dark. A liquid echo of spoiled grace. Spilling it was worse. A few drops on the ground wasn't just a mess, it was an omen. People believed the floor had to be cleaned with blessed cloths. Some even dug out the dirt beneath the spill and reburied it elsewhere. And God forbid you spilled it during a blessing. That wasn't just clumsiness. That was seen as a rejection of divine protection. A literal loss of favor, one splash at a time. There were even tales of holy water burning witches or boiling if evil was nearby. If a suspected witch dipped their fingers in and didn't react, it proved nothing. But if it steamed, hissed, or crackled, that was confirmation. The water had sensed something unholy. And then there were the people who used it too much, dousing every corner of the house, pouring it on animals, sprinkling it on their breakfast. Overuse wasn't seen as devotion, it was obsession. And obsession, as the church often warned, opened the door to sin. Even holy things, if misused, could become dangerous. In short, holy water was revered, but never taken lightly. It was a shield, yes, but a shield that had to be polished, maintained, respected. Because in a world where demons were always lurking just beyond the candlelight, even your blessings came with a warning label. In the Middle Ages, justice was often poetic. And by poetic, we mean completely unhinged. Not only could people be tried and punished for crimes they didn't commit, but so could animals. Yes, animals. Real, four-legged, confused creatures were hauled into court, given legal representation, and sentenced just like humans. Because in medieval law, no one, not even a chicken, was above the rules. Let's say a pig bites a child. Today, there'd be animal control, maybe a vet visit, and a hard conversation about safety. In medieval Europe, that pig could be arrested. Actually arrested, shackled, brought before a judge, and placed on trial for murder. And it didn't stop with pigs. Dogs, cows, goats, even insects were tried for everything from property damage to assault. There's a recorded case of weevils, yes, bugs, being summoned to court for destroying crops. The trial went on for weeks. The bugs did not appear. But when animals did show up, dragged or carried into the courtroom, the proceedings were astonishingly formal. A lawyer was assigned to represent the animal. Witnesses were called, testimonies given, and in some cases sentencing was carried out with the same grim finality as a human execution. Punishments varied. A pig that killed a child might be hanged in the village square, dressed in clothes for the occasion, because symbolism matters. A rooster that laid an egg, a rare but biologically possible phenomenon, could be burned at the stake for witchcraft. Horses believed to be possessed were exorcised or put down. Cats accused of demonic influence were drowned en masse. In some regions, cats were so persecuted that their absence allowed plague-carrying rats to thrive. Oops. To the medieval mind, this wasn't absurd, it was order. Every creature was part of God's design, and if one behaved badly, that meant it had stepped out of its divine role. Justice had to be restored, not just for the victims, but for the spiritual balance of the community. And there was a deeper fear behind it all. People believed that Satan could possess animals, using them to carry out harm. So a murderous pig wasn't just a threat, it was a message, a warning, a symbol that something darker was creeping into their world. Some animal trials even made it to appeals courts. In one case, rats accused of crop destruction were defended by a clever lawyer who argued they had the right to a safe route to court, free from cat attacks. The trial stalled. The rats won. The crops, however, remained ruined. It's easy to laugh now, but these trials were deadly serious. They reveal a world desperate to impose logic on chaos, to explain the unexplainable, to punish misfortune, and sometimes to dress a pig in trousers and sentence it to death. In the modern world, the orientation of a grave is a matter of design, space, or family tradition. In the Middle Ages, it was theology, doctrine, cosmic alignment. Because if you were buried facing the wrong direction, it wasn't just an oversight. It was a spiritual disaster, a mistake that could ruin your afterlife. The dead, it was believed, must face east, always east. Their feet pointed in that direction, their head at the west, so that when Judgment Day came and the dead were resurrected from their graves, they would rise facing the rising sun, and more importantly, facing Christ. Because Christ, according to Scripture, would appear in the east when he returned to judge the living and the dead. Miss the sunrise and you might miss salvation. This wasn't a casual tradition. It was enforced. Cemeteries were laid out meticulously. Graves were dug with care, ensuring every corpse was aligned. Even the poorest peasant, if they were given a Christian burial, would be placed eastward, no matter how shallow the grave or haphazard the coffin. But there were exceptions, and they weren't kind. Priests, for example, were sometimes buried in the opposite direction, head toward the east, so they could rise facing their flock on Judgment Day, as if ready to lead them one final time. A symbolic gesture of pastoral duty even in death. But for others, being buried the wrong way was a punishment. Suicides, heretics, excommunicates, those who had defied the church or died in spiritual disgrace, were often denied the honor of facing east. They might be buried at a crossroads, feet in the wrong direction, or even face down. It wasn't just exclusion, it was eternal disorientation, a way to show the world and heaven that this soul had lost its way. Facing east was more than a compass point. It was hope. It meant you were waiting for Christ, ready to be judged, cleansed, and taken into paradise. Facing west, on the other hand, meant you'd turned your back on salvation. It meant darkness, the place where the sun dies. This orientation influenced more than just burial. Churches were built with altars facing east, so worshippers prayed in the same direction. Beds were arranged so people slept with their heads to the west and feet to the east, a symbolic rehearsal for the final rest. Even when people were dying, they were sometimes turned to face east in their final moments, so their soul would depart looking toward the light. All of this may sound strange now, but in the medieval worldview, geography and theology were inseparable. The physical position of your body was linked to the destiny of your soul. And if the world was ending, and it often felt like it might, you wanted to make absolutely sure that when you rose from the grave, you were looking in the right direction. In the modern world, bells are ceremonial. They mark weddings, call people to prayer, or announce the hour. But in the Middle Ages, bells were weapons, not of war, but of defense. Spiritual defense. Because when plague swept through towns and death crept down every alley, people didn't just pray. They rang the bells, loudly, constantly, desperately. The belief was simple. Sound could drive away evil. And there was no sound more powerful, more spiritually resonant, than the toll of a church bell. Bells were blessed instruments. They weren't just metal. they were sacred objects, often christened like people, given names, washed with holy water, and anointed with oil. They were the voice of the church, the sound of God's presence, and during times of plague, that voice was put to work. When pestilence struck, black boils, sudden fevers, corpses piling in the streets, people turned to the bells. Ringing them was believed to disperse the foul air, the miasma that was thought to carry disease. The vibrations of the bell would push away the poisoned wind. It would chase demons from rooftops. It would keep death itself confused, unable to settle in one place long enough to do its work. So villages rang bells day and night, not just in churches but in town squares, watchtowers, and anywhere with a clapper and a rope. Bell ringers became frontline defenders. Some were volunteers. Others were ordered to the task. And over time they became as feared as they were respected, because if you were ringing the plague bell, you were near the dying. You were marked by the sound you carried. There were even special plague bells, smaller handbells used during processions or to announce the approach of infected carts. People would hear them before they saw the sick. A clear, sharp ring cutting through the still air. A warning, death is near, keep away. And yet people believed the same sound that warned them could also save them. That the bell could break the curse, shatter the spell, disrupt the invisible forces that carried disease from house to house. In some towns, the bells were rung every hour. In others, they were sounded continuously, as if silence itself might invite plague closer. Of course, none of it worked, not in the way people hoped. The plague came anyway, over and over. But to the medieval mind, you didn't stop ringing. You couldn't. Because if you did, you weren't just giving in to sickness, you were inviting it. The silence after a bell stops is deafening. And in the 14th century, silence meant surrender. In the Middle Ages, few things were as terrifying as death. Not just because it ended life, but because it might not end everything. People didn't just fear dying, they feared what came after. And most of all, they feared that the dead might not stay where they belonged. So when someone died, the entire home became sacred ground. And one of the simplest, most serious rules was this: take off your shoes. No shoes in the house of the dead. Why? Because shoes, they believed, carried the living world into the space of the dead. Dirt, noise, and the energy of life had no place near a soul in transition. The deceased needed peace. They needed silence. And they needed the boundary between life and death to be respected. Shoes were a violation, not just of manners, but of metaphysical order. More than that, shoes were believed to trap souls. The sound of footsteps might confuse a lingering spirit, make it believe someone else had come to take its place. Or worse, the dead might try to follow the sound back into the world. Every creak of leather was a risk. Every step could be an invitation. So, shoes came off the moment someone entered a death room. Guests, priests, mourners, all barefoot or in socks. The floor was swept clean, often sprinkled with herbs or salt to purify the space. Windows were opened so the soul could leave freely. Mirrors covered, clocks stopped, and yes, shoes removed. There were deeper beliefs tied to this ritual too. Some thought that spirits could hide in shoes, especially ones made from leather. Animal skin held memory, they said, and if a soul was confused or vengeful, it might anchor itself to something so close to the ground, so worn by the living, that it could sneak back with whoever wore them next. Stories spread. A man who forgot to remove his boots and heard footsteps behind him for weeks. A woman who stepped too loudly and fell ill the next day. A child who laughed during a wake and woke up screaming from nightmares about someone walking across the ceiling. Shoes weren't just footwear, they were boundary crossers, symbols of travel, of movement, of life, and in the presence of death they had to be silenced. The house of mourning was quiet, sacred, and still. You entered with bare feet and hushed breath, because if the dead were watching, the last thing you wanted was to be the one who made them feel like they'd been left behind. In the modern world, owls are mysterious, even majestic, symbols of wisdom perched in children's books and university logos. But in the Middle Ages, owls weren't scholars. They were omens, terrible ones. Their cry wasn't wise. It was a warning, a death sentence echoing through the night. To hear an owl's call after dark was to hear the voice of death itself. A screech or hoot near your home meant someone inside might not live to see the sunrise. It didn't matter if the person was healthy. It didn't matter if no one was sick. The sound alone was enough. The owl had chosen, and its choice could not be unmade. This fear ran deep through European folklore. Owls were creatures of the night, of shadows and silence. They hunted when other birds slept. They saw in darkness. They flew without sound. These weren't traits of ordinary animals. These were signs of the otherworldly, signs that the owl belonged more to the realm of spirits than to flesh and blood. In many places, people believed owls didn't just predict death, they caused it. Their eyes were cursed. Their wings carried unseen illness. Their call was a spell spoken in the dark. A single hoot could summon fever. Two might invite a ghost. And if an owl landed on your roof or windowsill, you didn't open the door. You prepared for a funeral. Some even believed owls were witches in disguise. Women who had made pacts with dark forces could supposedly shift into owl form to spy, curse, or punish. In stories passed down in firelight whispers, owls flew into homes through open chimneys or perched on rafters, watching the family within. Someone would always die afterward. The result? Panic. If someone heard an owl cry, they would douse the lamps, say prayers, burn herbs, mark the door with chalk or ash. Anything to undo the omen. Anything to convince the spirit world they weren't ready to be taken. Owls were hunted, chased, and driven away. Some were nailed to barn doors to protect the house. A gruesome act meant to send a message to other unseen forces. Not today. And even if you weren't the one visited, you watched your neighbors. You listened. Because if an owl cried over their roof, it meant danger was circling yours too. Misfortune rarely traveled alone. So the next time you hear an owl calling in the night, and you feel that prickling on the back of your neck, just remember, once upon a time, that sound meant something was coming, something final, something with wings. In the Middle Ages, one death was a tragedy. 2 was alarming. But 3? That was confirmation of a curse. Because in villages from England to Italy, people whispered the same chilling belief. Death always comes in 3s. You'd see it in the way people stared at the ground during funerals, already counting. Who's next? Who's after that? The first death cracked the world open. The second swung the door wide, and the third closed it shut. A grim pattern that felt less like coincidence and more like a divine rhythm, one that couldn't be interrupted, only endured. It didn't matter how someone died. Illness, accident, childbirth, old age, it all counted. Once someone passed, a mental clock started ticking. People waited for the second death. They expected it. And once the second came, fear set in like frost. The third was inevitable. It might be a neighbor, a child, you. No one was safe until the cycle completed itself. This belief shaped behavior. After the first funeral, people lit candles constantly. They covered mirrors again. They avoided travel, avoided risk, avoided living, if only for a few cursed days. It was common to delay weddings, births, and even baptisms after a death. To celebrate anything during the death cycle was to mock the balance and risk becoming number 3. And if the third death didn't happen naturally, people got suspicious. They looked for signs. A goat that died overnight might be counted. A miscarriage. A stranger passing through town and never returning. The mind needed a third death, just to close the loop. Without it, the village felt unfinished, spiritually exposed. Some families even performed rituals to protect themselves, burning herbs, passing around bread, reading psalms backward. In more desperate cases, they'd tie knots into cords and hang them above doors, each knot representing a life preserved. Superstition didn't comfort anyone, but it gave them something to do, a way to keep the darkness at bay. Clergy, too, acknowledged the pattern. Not officially, but quietly. Priests offered extra blessings. Masses were held for no one in particular. Graves were dug in advance, not out of efficiency but as an act of surrender, a way of saying, "We know you're coming. We're ready." To break the cycle was to tempt fate. People avoided saying the names of the dead during that time, avoided talking about death at all, because naming it was like knocking on a sealed door, and you never knew who or what might answer. So, when someone died in your village, you didn't just mourn. You waited, you watched, and you prayed that the pattern wouldn't find you. In the modern world, bathing is a daily habit. Warm water, scented soap, a moment of peace. In the Middle Ages, bathing was a dangerous gamble. To step into a bath wasn't just a cleansing ritual. It was, in the eyes of many, a risk to your health, your soul, and your life. The belief was rooted in an old, terrifying logic. Opening your pores meant opening your body to illness. Medieval physicians, trained more in humors than hygiene, taught that hot water made the body vulnerable. It softened the skin, weakened the balance of your inner elements, and allowed disease to seep in. So, if you bathed too often, or at the wrong time, you were basically inviting death through the front door. Cleanliness, ironically, was considered a liability. Now, that's not to say people never bathed. Public bathhouses did exist, especially in cities, but even those came with risk, not just from disease, but from temptation. Bathhouses were places where men and women gathered, often naked, sometimes together. The church saw this as dangerous, a breeding ground not for health, but for sin. Scandal, gossip, and extracurriculars happened often enough that many bathhouses were shut down completely. In rural villages, bathing was rare. A peasant might wash their hands, face, or feet occasionally, but full immersion. That was for special occasions or emergencies. Some believed you should only bathe a few times a year, maybe for a wedding, maybe before Easter. And even then, you didn't use hot water, lukewarm at best. Cold, ideally, something to shock the body into strength rather than lull it into weakness. Soap was another story. It existed, but it wasn't the flowery, foamy bar we know today. It was often made from animal fat, ashes, and lye, rough, harsh, and more useful for scrubbing clothes than skin. People used it sparingly, if at all. Many relied on herbal rinses, vinegar, or just water. Dirty water, at that. And if someone bathed regularly, that raised eyebrows. Who were they trying to impress? What were they hiding? Cleanliness became associated with vanity, and vanity was a sin. The result? Medieval bodies were often covered in layers of grime, perfume, and linen. Instead of bathing, people changed their underclothes more frequently. Clean linens against the skin were believed to draw out impurities. Baths were out. Laundry was in. This fear of bathing persisted for centuries. Even into the Renaissance, doctors warned against it. Royalty avoided it. People believed diseases like the plague or syphilis could be caused by a bath. In some cases, the sick were forbidden to bathe, lest their condition worsen. So, the next time you enjoy a hot shower, imagine a world where stepping into that water meant risking everything: your health, your reputation, your soul. In the Middle Ages, to bathe too often wasn't refreshing. It was reckless. Today, a full moon is romantic. A backdrop for poetry, late-night walks, and maybe a werewolf joke or two. But in the Middle Ages, the moon wasn't charming. It was terrifying. People believed it could twist your body, infect your mind, and summon forces you couldn't control. The moon didn't just light the night, it changed it. And not for the better. The word lunatic comes from luna, Latin for moon. That's not a coincidence. Medieval thinkers believed that madness was directly linked to lunar phases. A full moon could stir up inner chaos. It could spark fits, confusion, or rage. And if someone was already sick, mentally or physically, the moon would make them worse. People didn't just blame the moon for odd behavior. They feared it as a trigger for real danger. Doctors warned against bloodletting or surgery during certain moon phases. They believed the body was ruled by tides, like the ocean, and the moon pulled at the blood. To operate during the wrong phase was to invite death. You might bleed out, you might go mad, or your wound simply wouldn't heal. Pregnant women were warned not to go outside under a full moon. The light, they said, could cause birth defects, or miscarriage, or moon sickness, a vague and terrifying curse that could leave a child pale, weak, or possessed. Children born during eclipses were marked. Not always evil, but never ordinary. The moon also played a role in curses. Many believed witches cast their most powerful spells under a waxing moon. A love charm here, a death hex there, all supercharged by moonlight. That meant when the moon was full, no one slept well. Villages stayed quiet. Doors were bolted. Charms were placed under pillows and near doorways. Shadows moved differently during those nights, and no one trusted them. If a crime was committed under a full moon, it was considered worse. Some even believed the moon exposed your soul, that if you had something to hide, the moonlight would reveal it. You might not notice it, but the spirits would. The dead would. God would. And then there were the practical fears. More robberies happened during full moons, more assaults, more disappearances. Not because the moon caused evil, but because it allowed people to see at night, to move without torches. Darkness was safety, moonlight was exposure. So if the moon was high and bright in the sky, people took it seriously. You didn't make major decisions. You didn't travel. You didn't stare at it too long. Because looking directly at a full moon was said to bring on madness, or draw the gaze of something looking back. In the Middle Ages, demons weren't abstract. They weren't metaphors for temptation or poetic expressions of sin. They were real, invisible, powerful, lurking, watching from behind trees, under beds, and especially at the edges of your sanity. And while prayers were the church's official defense, most people believed in a far simpler, earthier weapon: iron. Iron wasn't just a metal, it was protection. People carried bits of it in their pockets, hung it over doorways, nailed it above cradles. A simple iron nail, worn smooth with use, could be the line between safety and spiritual attack. Why? Because iron was believed to repel the unnatural. It was the enemy of enchantment. It didn't just hurt demons, it humiliated them. This belief wasn't limited to folklore. Midwives carried iron when delivering babies. Travelers packed iron hooks in their bags. Brides were sometimes gifted horseshoes before their wedding, not for luck, but to keep spirits away during a time when the soul was seen as especially vulnerable. Even blacksmiths were seen as quasi-magical figures. Their work with iron gave them power. In some villages, the forge was considered sacred ground, a place where evil couldn't enter. Stories were told of demons tricked, bound, or driven off by men who hammered out nails not just for horseshoes, but for spiritual war. People believed demons and fairies couldn't cross a threshold protected with iron. A knife beneath your pillow? It wasn't for intruders. It was to keep dreams clean, your soul untouched, while your body slept. Iron at the bedside wasn't just habit, it was defense. And if someone showed signs of possession, a sudden illness, strange behavior, visions, or unexplained strength, one of the first things done was to press iron to their skin. If they recoiled, it was proof. If they didn't, the fear didn't go away, but it shifted. Maybe the demon was smarter. Maybe it needed something stronger. There were darker stories, too. Tales of people who stopped carrying iron and were never seen again. Of children taken by spirits, replaced by changelings, because a parent had forgotten to place a blade near the cradle that night. Iron wasn't a superstition. It was routine, like locking a door. You did it because you knew what might happen if you didn't. Over time, the reasons faded, but the rituals stayed. Superstitions hardened into traditions. Horseshoes stayed above doors. Iron trinkets passed down generations. And even today, traces remain. A subconscious fear of old forests, of thin places, of shadows that fall just a little too long. So next time you feel uneasy in an empty room, or catch a flicker in the corner of your eye, ask yourself, what's in your pocket? And hope it's iron. In the Middle Ages, air wasn't just air. It was a living, moving force. And sometimes it carried more than just the smell of dung or smoke. A sudden breeze wasn't refreshing. It was suspicious. And if you had a newborn in the house, a gust of wind could be deadly. It wasn't about the chill or the draft. It was about spirits. The wind, they believed, was the highway of the invisible. Souls, demons, fairies, disease, they all rode on it, especially at dawn, dusk, or just after a storm. So when a baby was born, families scrambled to seal the house, windows closed, chimneys covered, cracks stuffed with cloth or moss, because one breath of cursed air, they said, could snatch the infant's soul clean out of its body. The newborn, in medieval belief, wasn't fully anchored to this world. Its soul was new, fragile, not yet toughened by prayer, ritual, or time. It was half here, half elsewhere. And the wind, especially a fast, sharp wind, was the perfect thief. Some called it elf shot. Others called it spirit breath. Whatever the name, it could strike without warning. If a baby fell ill suddenly, turned pale, refused to feed, or cried endlessly for no reason, people didn't ask about hygiene or nutrition. They asked if someone had left the door open, if a breeze had passed over the crib, if the baby had been taken out too early before it was sealed with proper protection. That protection came in many forms. Charms were tied to cradles, little iron trinkets, crosses, teeth, or bundles of herbs. Mothers hung cloth over windows and burned sage or rosemary inside. In some places, a thread soaked in mother's milk was tied around the baby's wrist to anchor the soul. The goal was simple. Keep the wind out, and if it got in, make sure it left empty-handed. Midwives warned against taking a baby outside before it was blessed. Not even to the garden, not even at midday. Some said 3 days, others said a full moon cycle. But all agreed. A child exposed to open air too soon was at the mercy of forces beyond understanding. If the worst happened, and the baby died, people spoke of the wind sickness, a cruel, invisible hand that left no wound, no mark, just silence, and a cradle that would never be used again. To modern minds, it sounds like fear and folklore. But to a medieval parent, it was grief woven into the air itself. A loss you couldn't see, couldn't fight, could only try, desperately, to prevent. So when the wind howled through the thatch roof or rattled the shutters at night, no one slept easy, especially not the ones with a child in the house. Names in the Middle Ages weren't just labels, they were spells, sacred bindings, invisible tags that could protect you, curse you, or decide your entire fate. To name something was to give it form, not just in the world of men, but in the eyes of heaven and hell. So when a child was born, choosing a name wasn't a light decision. It wasn't about honoring a grandparent or picking something that sounded noble. It was about protection, identity, power. A proper name, usually one taken from a saint, was believed to place the child under divine guardianship. It was like linking the infant's fragile soul to a spiritual bodyguard. If you named your child after St. George, it wasn't just for tradition. You were asking St. George to watch, to shield, to fight off whatever darkness was waiting outside the cottage walls. But choose wrong. That was dangerous. Naming a child after someone who had died young or tragically could transfer their fate. If you gave your baby the name of a sibling who had passed, you weren't honoring the dead, you were tempting repetition. Some believed this would confuse spirits, or worse, invite the old soul to return, reborn into the same doomed life. Even saying a baby's name too soon after birth was risky. Before baptism, the child was considered spiritually unprotected, open to demonic influence. Speaking their name aloud was like drawing a target. It was common to refer to newborns only by nicknames, or simply as the child, until they were officially named and blessed. In some regions, especially among poorer communities, children weren't named until several days, sometimes weeks, after birth. Why? Because so many infants died early. Giving a name to a baby who might not survive was considered wasteful. Or worse, bad luck. The name had power. Giving it to a dying child could weaken its force, leave it tainted for the next one. And then there were naming taboos. Names associated with heretics, traitors, or those burned by the church were absolutely forbidden. Naming a child Judas. You might as well leave the door open for demons. Some names were considered so cursed that just hearing them spoken aloud could darken your luck for a day. On the other hand, naming a child after a powerful saint was seen as a lifelong blessing. Saints who had performed miracles, resisted temptation, or died heroically in battle or martyrdom were in high demand. These names acted like armor, especially when followed by baptism, prayers, and a charm tucked into the swaddling cloth. A name wasn't just a beginning. It was a fate. And in a world where curses whispered through the trees and angels walked just behind the fog, you didn't choose a name to make someone smile. You chose it to keep them alive. In the Middle Ages, your hair wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a spiritual antenna. A living extension of your soul, your status, and your vulnerability. Cutting it, washing it, or even touching it came with rules, risks, and consequences. Because in medieval belief, hair held power, and mishandling it could invite everything from bad luck to outright possession. Let's start with the basics. Hair was thought to carry energy, not metaphorically, literally. It absorbed blessings, curses, sin, and grace. That's why saints and monks often shaved their heads in tonsure, to show humility, to break vanity, but also to remove the worldly veil between themselves and God. Hair was earthly. Cutting it meant purification. But for the average person, cutting hair was not something you did lightly. There were rules for when and how. Hair was never cut during a full moon, never on holy days, and never during illness. People believed trimming hair while sick could weaken the soul, make the body vulnerable, and open the gates to spiritual attack. Women, especially, were warned to avoid brushing or cutting their hair at night, lest they draw attention from spirits, or worse, the devil himself. Unwashed hair was common, not because people were lazy, but because of fear. Washing too often, especially with hot water, was believed to release the soul's defenses. Hair left wet was thought to attract evil, especially if you fell asleep with it damp. The next day's headache? A spirit had walked through your dreams, using your hair as a tether. Even hair loss had spiritual interpretations. If someone's hair started falling out, they were said to be cursed, paying for sins, or under the influence of a spell. Baldness in men was sometimes pitied, sometimes feared. In women, it was tragic. Hair was tied to fertility, vitality, and divine favor. A woman with long, thick hair was considered spiritually strong. A woman who lost her hair? Suspect. And then there was the danger of loose hair. A woman who wore her hair unbound in public was making a statement, and not a good one. It suggested rebellion, sensuality, or madness. Brides might wear their hair down once on their wedding day, symbolizing purity and openness to life. After that, it was to be braided, veiled, or hidden. To walk through town with your hair down was to invite stares, whispers, and possibly an accusation of witchcraft. Hair was also a tool for curses. In many superstitions, a lock of hair was all a witch needed to work a spell. That's why people burned their cut hair or buried it deep. Throwing it in the trash? Never. That was giving someone a weapon against you. Some even swallowed a strand of their own hair for protection, believing it would keep them spiritually closed to attack. So, if you lived in medieval Europe, every strand mattered. Your hair wasn't just part of you, it was you. And you didn't let just anyone touch it. Because in the wrong hands, it wasn't hair, it was a handle. Wells were lifelines in medieval villages. They brought water, something precious, vital, and scarce. But they were also deep, dark, and still. And in a time when people believed that every shadow had a secret, wells weren't just practical. They were portals. Looking into a well was never casual. You didn't lean in too far. You didn't stare too long. Because if you did, you risked more than falling in. You risked being seen. The belief was that wells connected this world to another, not just underground, but underworld. The reflective surface of the water was thought to be a veil, a mirror, a gateway. To peer into it too long was to invite whatever was beneath to peer back. Spirits, demons, old gods, all might linger in the depths, waiting for someone foolish enough to meet their gaze. Stories circulated of villagers who looked too long and went mad, who swore they saw a face staring back, not their own, but something else. Some said that the well could steal your reflection, and with it, your soul. Others believed that speaking near a well at twilight could cause your words to echo in both worlds, and someone on the other side might answer. Wells became places of both reverence and fear. Offerings were sometimes dropped into them, coins, herbs, even food, to keep the spirits calm. Children were warned never to play near one. Not just because they might fall, but because they might disappear. Taken, they said, by the thing that lives in the water when the moon is full. Certain times of day were especially risky. Dusk, midnight, the moment just before sunrise. These were thin hours, when the world was most open to other forces. If you had to draw water then, you did it quickly. You didn't look. You didn't speak. You didn't wait to hear what the wind might carry up from the bottom. Even dreams about wells were considered ominous. Dreaming of falling into one meant illness. Dreaming of hearing a voice from one meant betrayal. Dreaming of a well overflowing, that was death. Some healers claimed wells had power, sacred water that could cure fever, banish curses, or help the barren conceive. But that water had to be drawn at dawn, in silence, and with the right prayer. And never looked into, not even once. Because curing the body at the cost of the soul wasn't healing, it was trade. In a world where the unseen ruled as much as the seen, the well was never just a hole in the ground. It was a threshold, a mouth, a place where water flowed. And sometimes things waited. So, if you ever find yourself beside an old stone well in a quiet village and the surface of the water seems too still, don't look. In the Middle Ages, you didn't just toss your boots on the table after a long day. You didn't place them there in jest. You didn't let them rest there for a moment. Because shoes on a table weren't just seen as messy or disrespectful. They were seen as a direct invitation to death. The superstition was simple, specific, and deeply feared. Placing shoes on a table, any table, but especially one used for eating, was a symbol of mortality, a sign that someone in the house would die. Maybe soon, maybe suddenly. But certainly, it may seem ridiculous now, but in a world where every gesture carried symbolic weight, the shoe-on-table omen wasn't taken lightly. The reasoning had layers, spiritual, symbolic, and practical. Shoes belonged to the ground, to the outside, to the dirty, chaotic realm beyond the safety of home. Tables were places of nourishment, family, and sanctity. To place what touches the earth onto what touches your mouth was a reversal, a contamination, an omen. Some linked it directly to funerals. When people died, especially the poor, their shoes were often placed near or on a table during preparations for burial. Not out of ritual, but out of necessity. Clothes were laid out, shoes included. Over time, that image solidified into superstition. Shoes on the table meant death was near, just as it had been during the last funeral. Others believed it was a symbolic act of arrogance, an unconscious display of disrespect toward the home, the ancestors, or the spirits that protected the hearth. It wasn't just dirty, it was dangerous. You were upsetting the balance, you were mocking fate. The reaction was swift and serious. If someone made the mistake, even accidentally, the shoes were immediately removed, followed by frantic counter-rituals. Some would sprinkle salt on the table. Others would knock 3 times on wood, then cross themselves. Some households had set prayers or phrases they recited the moment it happened. Anything to break the spell before it took root. And it wasn't just limited to physical shoes. In some places, even talking about placing shoes on the table was considered bad luck. Joking about it was worse. If someone tested the superstition, they weren't just risking themselves, they were risking everyone under that roof. This fear extended into daily behavior. Shoes were kept low, never lifted onto benches, stools, or tables. Even cobblers who worked with shoes constantly had their own rules. Shoes in progress stayed on racks or the floor. Finished shoes were handed to clients, never displayed atop their work tables. So, the next time you kick off your sneakers and toss them onto a surface, think of the medieval family gasping in horror, scrambling to undo the curse they believe you just summoned. In their world, it wasn't superstition, it was survival. Because in medieval homes, death didn't knock. It crept in on souls. Salt was more than seasoning, it was sacred. It preserved meat, purified wounds, and most importantly, protected the soul. To the medieval mind, salt wasn't just a practical tool, it was spiritual armor, and nowhere was that belief more visible than at the threshold of the home. Sprinkling salt along a doorway wasn't just a habit, it was a barrier, a line that evil could not cross. Demons, witches, malevolent spirits, all were said to recoil from salt. Its purity, its permanence, its incorruptibility made it a divine weapon. Evil hated what it couldn't taint. Thresholds, too, were liminal spaces, the border between safe and unsafe, inside and outside, known and unknown. And in a world filled with invisible dangers, that line had to be guarded. Salt was the first line of defense. It wasn't just homes, stables, barns, even fields during planting season. All had salt scattered at the edge. Not to kill weeds, but to keep spirits out. Travelers carried pouches of salt and sprinkled pinches in inns before they slept. Some would draw a ring of salt around their bedding, creating a temporary fortress in a dangerous world. For new homes, salt was one of the first things brought inside, often alongside bread and wine. Salt on the floor, or even mixed into the mortar of the threshold, was a declaration. Evil will not enter here. No matter how humble the cottage, that act was sacred, and woe to anyone who spilled it. To spill salt, especially during a time of fear or change, a new baby, a death, a storm, was seen as a terrible omen. You weren't just making a mess, you were weakening your defense, inviting darkness. The ritual was immediate. Gather the spilled salt, toss a pinch over your left shoulder. Not your right, always the left, where the devil was believed to lurk. Even inside the church, salt had power. It was used in baptisms, exorcisms, and blessings. Holy water was sometimes made by mixing salt into it. Some clergy said salt was a symbol of Christ himself, incorruptible, eternal. Others saw it as a weapon left behind by angels when they fell from heaven. Either way, it wasn't just a kitchen item, it was sacred ammunition. In folk rituals, salt was placed in shoes, sewn into pillowcases, or added to protective charms. A woman accused of witchcraft might be secretly tested with salt, placed beneath her stool during questioning to see if she reacted. If she shifted, it was a sign. If she stood and the salt was disturbed, even worse. So, in a world filled with curses, whispers, and things that slithered unseen, salt was comfort. Salt was control. Salt was safety. And if you valued your life, you made sure your doorway never went without it. Your body wasn't just flesh and bone, it was evidence. A map that could condemn you or, if you were lucky, spare you. And nothing was more feared, more scrutinized, or more misunderstood than the so-called witch's mark. A witch's mark, they said, was a physical sign that someone had made a pact with the devil. It could be a mole, a freckle, a birthmark, a scar, any unusual blemish on the skin. The more hidden it was, the more suspicious it became. If it was misshapen, discolored, or oddly placed, that was confirmation. The belief was simple and terrifying. The devil left his signature. When someone pledged their soul, Satan branded them with a mark only he and his followers could see. But of course, inquisitors claimed they could see it too, if they looked closely enough. Accused of witchcraft? One of the first things done during interrogation was a full body inspection. Men searched men. Women searched women. Sometimes midwives were ordered to do it, especially if the suspect was female. These searches were invasive, humiliating, and brutal. Entire villages gathered to witness them. They pricked the skin with needles or pins. If the accused didn't feel pain or didn't bleed from a particular spot, that was taken as proof. The so-called devil's teat, a place numbed by dark magic, where demons could feed. Some claimed the mark moved, that it disappeared, only to return later, that it could hide from holy eyes. If a person had no mark, that didn't guarantee innocence. But if they did, that was enough. Enough for imprisonment, enough for torture, enough for fire. People became paranoid. A birthmark that had been with you since childhood became a death sentence. A mole on your back might mean you were consorting with spirits. A wart on your hand could send you to the stake. Parents watched their children carefully, hoping they would grow out of strange marks. Lovers hid blemishes from each other. Healers inspected their own skin in private, terrified someone might notice something that shouldn't be there. And the irony? Most of the accused were old, poor, or both. People whose bodies bore the natural signs of hard lives, burns, scars, sunspots, skin diseases. What the church called a mark of evil was often just the mark of suffering. Some tried to cut their marks away. Others burned them off. But even the scar left behind became its own kind of proof. So if you lived in medieval Europe and had anything unusual on your skin, you prayed it stayed hidden. You covered it with cloth, shadow, anything, because a simple mark could become your undoing. The devil didn't need to speak in medieval courts. He just had to show up under your skin. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't just a legal contract or a romantic union. It was a spiritual ceremony filled with risk, ritual, and an overwhelming fear of getting it wrong. Because if you spoke the wrong words, stepped on the wrong stone, married on the wrong day, you weren't just dooming the relationship. You were cursing your lives, both of them. Medieval people believed that marriage was bound not only by the church, but by unseen forces eager to twist the threads of fate. Love, when it existed, was a luxury. Most marriages were arranged, transactional, and deeply entangled in spiritual consequences. And those consequences began well before the couple said, "I do." First, the date had to be chosen carefully. Some days were blessed, others were cursed. Marrying during Lent or Advent was frowned upon. Weddings on Fridays, considered the day of Christ's death, were seen as inviting sorrow into the marriage. Marrying on a full moon? Risky. Marrying under a waning moon? Worse. People consulted calendars, stars, and saints' feast days like oracles, praying the timing would please the heavens. The ceremony itself was a battleground of superstition. Rings weren't just symbols of love, they were spiritual shackles. The priest would often bless them with holy water, sometimes 3 times, to ensure no evil spirit had tainted the gold. Vows had to be said perfectly. A slip of the tongue was bad luck. A pause in the wrong place? A sign that the devil was listening. The bride's hair was another matter entirely. Worn down, it symbolized virginity, vulnerability, and openness to life. But if the hair wasn't properly braided, if strands fell across her face during the ceremony, it was seen as a bad omen. Some said it meant sorrow. Others whispered it was a sign she'd bury her husband early. Protection rituals were woven into the entire day. Charms were sewn into wedding garments. Salt might be sprinkled on the threshold. Crosses drawn on shoes. The idea was simple: ward off evil. Because everyone knew that weddings attracted attention, from both the living and the dead. And if a couple didn't follow the right steps, the consequences could be terrifying. Crops failed. Children didn't survive. Accidents came in 3s. In some cases, people believed the marriage had never been truly accepted by God, and that they were living in sin, cursed to walk hand in hand into damnation. There were stories, of course. A man who spoke his vows with crossed fingers. His wife disappeared a year later. A bride who wore black by accident. Her husband was dead within the week. A couple that married under a storm never saw peace again. Coincidence? Maybe. But to the medieval mind, everything was connected, especially when it came to vows spoken in front of God. So when 2 people stood at the altar, surrounded by incense, whispers, and the weight of unseen eyes, it wasn't just about love. It was about survival. Say the words right, say them clean, and pray that nothing in the shadows was listening. Before the church tightened its grip on marriage, there was hand fasting, a pre-Christian tradition that lingered in shadowed corners of Europe for centuries. It was old, flexible, and deeply feared by the church. Because while it united couples, it also carried with it the ancient weight of earthbound magic, folklore, and the watchful eyes of those who didn't answer to Rome, the so-called wise women, or, as they were often branded, hags. Hand fasting was a marriage, yes, but not always a permanent one. Two people would clasp hands, sometimes over a hearth or beneath a tree, and exchange vows. The hands were bound with cord or cloth, symbolizing unity. The union might last a year and a day, or until a child was born, or for life, depending on the custom and the community. There were no churches, no priests, just the land, the couple, and witnesses. And that made the church very nervous, because hand fasting often happened under the guidance of folk practitioners, midwives, herbalists, or granny women who knew the old rites. These women weren't officially trained, but they had inherited knowledge passed down through generations. When to marry, what herbs to wear, what moon to stand under. They read signs in bird flight and fire smoke. They spoke to spirits and seasons. To the church, they were dangerous. To the village, they were essential. These women were often feared and respected in equal measure. They might mix a fertility tea for the bride, or whisper protective words as they tied the binding cloth. But they were also blamed when things went wrong. A barren marriage? The hag must have botched the blessing. A stillborn child? The herbs were wrong. A bride who died young? A curse perhaps unspoken. Still, people went to them, especially the poor, the rural, and the desperate. Church weddings were expensive. Hand fasting was free. Holy matrimony came with judgment. Hand fasting came with flexibility, but that flexibility came at a cost, because the church increasingly labeled it sinful, illegitimate, pagan. And by association, anyone involved in it could be accused of witchcraft. By the late Middle Ages, hand fasting was still practiced, but in secret, at night, in woods, far from the eyes of clergy, and often under the guidance of a woman who knew the old words, but wouldn't write them down. Women who had delivered half the village, cured fevers with roots, and might one day be called to trial for saving too many lives too quietly. So, when a couple bound hands under moonlight instead of stained glass, they were doing more than making vows. They were choosing an older path, one paved with flowers and risk, with blessings whispered in dead languages, and the faint smell of sage and ash in the air. And just behind them, always watching, was the woman with the knotted hands and deep-set eyes, who might be a healer, or might be a curse herself. Either way, she would remember the binding. In the flickering glow of a single flame, medieval people saw more than just light. They saw fate. Candles weren't only for warmth or worship, they were windows into the unknown. And their shadows, those were the whispers of what came next. In a time when written words were rare and clocks didn't exist, candles marked more than the hour. They marked moods, omens, and unspoken messages. A steady flame was a blessing. A sputtering one? A warning. But it was the shadows that truly unsettled people, how they moved, where they stretched, and who they followed. The belief was simple and chilling. Shadows cast by candlelight revealed more than your body. They revealed your soul, and sometimes they revealed what your soul didn't know yet. It was said that if a shadow moved when you did not, or stretched in a direction the candle couldn't explain, it meant something was coming. Illness, a betrayal, even death. Some claimed to see shadows pass behind them with no source, not reflections but messages. Spirits passing by, or worse, staying to watch. During vigils, candles were watched closely. If the flame leaned hard in one direction and the shadow followed, especially if it moved toward a door that was believed to be the soul preparing to leave. Some would whisper prayers. Others would blow the candle out immediately, hoping to delay whatever was coming. At funerals, candles surrounded the dead, not just to honor them, but to light their passage to the next world, and to keep them from turning back. If a shadow flickered in the wrong direction during the service, people noticed. If a candle went out on its own, people murmured. That wasn't just wind, that was a presence, an unseen visitor making their exit. Young women sometimes gazed into candlelight to tell their fortunes. A quiet room, a mirror, a flame, and their future husband's face was said to appear in the shadows. But if they saw nothing, or worse, saw themselves alone, they didn't try again. Candles were also used in protection rituals. A candle lit in a sick room, placed at the foot of the bed, was meant to draw illness downward, out through the feet and into the earth. But if that candle cast two shadows instead of one, that meant the sickness was not alone, that something else, a spirit, a curse, was in the room with it. Even the length of the wick had meaning. Too long, and the flame was wild, uncontrolled, a soul in turmoil. Too short, and the flame barely held, a life burning too quickly. So medieval people watched their candles with reverence and fear. Because in those flickers and shadows, they saw what no priest could explain, what no doctor could heal, and what no one could fully escape. The future didn't shout. It danced softly on stone walls. If your milk soured too quickly, your cheese refused to form, or your cow suddenly stopped giving, it wasn't just bad luck, it was sabotage. Someone had cursed you. Or worse, something had infiltrated your barn. And when the butter wouldn't churn and the cream turned rancid, the first thing many did was look to the animals, especially the goat. Goats were odd to begin with. Eyes like slits, strange cries, independent personalities. They didn't behave like cows or sheep. They were clever, stubborn, and too curious for their own good. That alone made people nervous. But add centuries of folklore linking goats to witches and the devil, and you had the perfect scapegoat. Literally. If your dairy failed, people didn't check the temperature. They didn't test for contamination. They blamed the goat. Maybe it had been touched by a witch. Maybe it was a witch in disguise. Maybe it had looked at the cow funny, and the milk dried up in protest. Whatever the reason, the solution was swift and brutal. You got rid of the goat. Sometimes that meant exile. The goat was sold to a distant village. More often, it meant death. Not just to end the curse, but to send a message to the spirits, to the witches, to whatever dark thing had taken interest in your livestock. Burning the body was common. In some places, the ashes were buried at the four corners of the barn to seal the space and restore purity. The milk itself was considered spiritually delicate. It came from a living creature tied to fertility and nourishment. Anything that disrupted that process was seen as unnatural. And if the milk curdled as it poured, or blood came out instead of cream, people didn't hesitate. Someone, or something, was tampering with your animals. And the goat, standing there with its horizontal pupils and smug expression, was an easy villain. Even without evidence, suspicion was enough. If a neighbor had a grudge and your milk failed, people started whispering. If the village midwife owned a goat and someone nearby had dairy problems, the goat might disappear overnight, just to be safe. And it wasn't always just goats. Black cats, one-eyed roosters, cows with crooked horns, all were watched carefully. But goats were the most feared. Some said they danced at night. Some said they whispered in the barn. Some said if you stared into a goat's eyes too long, it would know your sins. So, in a world where survival hinged on milk, butter, and cheese, superstition ruled the farmyard. And if something went wrong, someone or something had to pay. It was rarely the cow. In a time when medicine was herbs and heartbreak was a matter of survival, love spells weren't just whispered wishes, they were rituals. And if you wanted a spell to work, to truly bind someone to you in body and soul, there was one ingredient that showed up more than you'd think. Dirt. Specifically, grave dirt. To medieval minds, love was dangerous. Passion could lead to scandal, sin, or worse, unwanted children and eternal damnation. But it was also irresistible. So when someone needed help in matters of the heart, they didn't go to a priest. They went to a cunning woman, a charm seller, a hedge witch, someone who knew how to mix the holy with the unholy, and who wasn't afraid to work with the dead. Grave dirt was believed to carry power, especially when taken from a freshly dug grave. The ideal was someone young, someone whose life had been cut short. Their longing, their unfulfilled desires, would fuel the spell. A pinch of this dirt, when mixed with herbs, wax, or bodily fluids, could make a love charm so potent it would haunt the heart of the victim. The dirt was usually sprinkled beneath a doorstep, hidden in food or drink, or buried beneath the target's bed. Sometimes it was mixed into a candle and burned slowly during recitation of the spell. The more intimate the dirt's location, the stronger its influence. But always, it had to remain secret. If the victim discovered the charm, the spell would break, or, worse, turn violent. Some believed the dirt didn't just carry energy, it carried the dead, that the spirit of the person whose grave had been disturbed would attach itself to the target, urging them toward obsession, passion, even madness. Stories spread of men who fell suddenly and violently in love, only to wander through the woods, muttering to themselves, unable to sleep or eat. Victims of love charms, villagers said. And always there was a grave nearby, disturbed just enough. But using grave dirt came with consequences. To steal from the dead, even for love, was a dangerous game. If the ritual wasn't done properly, if the spell wasn't sealed, the spirit could turn on the spellcaster. You might win a lover and gain a ghost, one that didn't like being used. So practitioners followed careful rules. The dirt had to be taken at night. Payment, usually silver or blood, had to be left behind. And the spell had to be burned, buried, or thrown into running water after it succeeded. To keep a love bound for too long was to tempt rot, emotional, physical, and spiritual. Because in the Middle Ages, even love had a price, and sometimes that price was measured in shovelfuls. Answers were hard to come by. Why did someone fall ill? Why didn't the rain come? Why did one family thrive while another starved? When priests couldn't explain it and healers failed to cure it, the village turned to something a little more feathered. Enter the chicken. Specifically, the sacrificial chicken, one of the most commonly used animals in medieval divination and superstition. Chickens were cheap, abundant, and most importantly, mysterious enough to act as messengers between the physical and spiritual worlds. And when something was seriously wrong, the people needed answers. That's when the chicken had its moment. The ritual was often called electriomancy, the practice of using a chicken's movements to interpret omens. A person in crisis, plagued by sickness, haunted by bad luck, or desperate for a sign, would bring a chicken to a wise woman, a hedge witch, or an old monk with flexible morals. They'd mark letters on the ground, or scatter grain in a ritual pattern, then release the bird. Where it pecked, that was the answer. If the chicken moved in a circle, it meant the problem was close, inside the home. If it flapped and refused to peck, it meant the spirits were angry. And if it stood still and stared into the distance, someone was going to die soon, But it didn't always end there. Sometimes the chicken was just the start of the ritual. For more serious inquiries, especially when the village believed witchcraft was involved, the chicken had to be killed. Slaughtered at dawn, often by the person seeking the answer. Its final movements, the dance, were carefully watched. Did it spasm toward a particular direction? That's where the curse came from. Did it convulse beside a person? That was the guilty one. If it bled too quickly, the answer was already known. But if the blood was slow or clotted, the spell was still working, still alive. It sounds barbaric now, but to the medieval mind this was logic, pattern, clarity in chaos. The chicken became a tool, like a compass spinning in blood. Of course, this put chickens in a strange place. Revered and feared. Some families wouldn't eat chickens used in rituals. Others believed a black chicken that danced too long might be a familiar spirit, a demon in disguise. If such a bird refused to die quickly, it was considered proof that something unnatural had taken hold of it. So, chickens clucked through medieval life with a strange sort of dignity. They fed the people, they told the future, and sometimes they gave their lives in hopes that someone could sleep through the night without hearing whispers at the window. Because when the future was uncertain and fear clawed at the edges of every moment, all it took was one flutter of wings to tip the balance. In a time when compasses were rare and the world itself felt shaped by forces both divine and demonic, direction mattered, especially when it came to sleep. To the medieval mind, how you slept was more than just a matter of comfort. It was a matter of life, death, and what came after. And one rule rose above the rest. Never sleep with your head pointing north and your feet south. The belief came from a blend of folklore, religion, and something deeper, a fear of the invisible highways that ran through the world. North was the direction of death, the land of cold winds, dark spirits, and ancient graves. It was said the dead were buried with their heads to the west, facing east to rise on Judgment Day. But north? North was where souls lost their way. Sleeping with your head pointed north aligned you with the dead, not in reverence, but in risk. You were mimicking their pose, tempting the spirits to mistake you for one of their own. In a world where spirits wandered freely at night, especially in thin hours just before dawn, laying north-south was like drawing a line across your soul and leaving one end open. People believed that such sleep could weaken you, drain your energy, or invite nightmares. Worse, it could attract something. A shadow that slipped through the crack of the door, a pressure on your chest in the early hours, a whisper that wasn't quite a dream, night terrors, sleep paralysis, even sudden death in bed. All of it was blamed on improper alignment. Midwives, monks, and old folk healers alike warned of the dangers. Children were gently turned in their beds if they shifted during sleep. Travelers were instructed to check their orientation before they lay down. Some carried small iron needles or bits of wood to place near their heads, just in case their compass sense failed. Iron, after all, was believed to ward off spirits, and spirits loved to travel north. There were exceptions, of course. Some monks chose to sleep north-south as an act of humility, a way of preparing for death. But for the average villager, it was reckless. To sleep that way was to lie down in the path of the dead and hope they passed you by. Even bed placement within a home reflected this belief. Beds were set with the head to the east when possible, facing the rising sun, symbolizing life and resurrection. East meant renewal. North meant forgetting, and no one wanted to wake up forgotten. So if you were wise, you slept carefully, with charms tucked beneath your pillow, with your head to the east or west, and your feet firmly planted away from the chill of the unseen. Because in the dark hours of medieval life, Even sleep wasn't safe. And north was where the cold things walked. Few things held more power or more potential for exploitation than holy relics. Bones of saints, drops of sacred blood, splinters from the true cross, vials of the Virgin's milk. Every church claimed to have one, and every pilgrim believed in their miracle-working might. But behind the reverence was an industry, a trade, a spiritual black market, and it was thriving. Relics were said to heal sickness, protect towns, bless crops, and drive out demons. People journeyed across countries just to see them. Touching one could cure blindness. Praying beside one might save a dying child. So, naturally, everyone wanted a relic. And if they couldn't get one honestly, they got creative. It wasn't uncommon for a single saint to have multiple skulls, all in different cities. St. Peter's bones were supposedly resting in half a dozen churches at once. The bones of anonymous martyrs were dug up from Roman catacombs, labeled with hopeful guesses, and sold to desperate parishes who needed a relic to draw pilgrims and their coins. Churches displayed these sacred objects in ornate reliquaries, golden boxes shaped like arms, feet, or whole bodies. Inside might be a toe bone or a sheep's knuckle. Few could tell the difference, and fewer dared to question it. To doubt a relic's authenticity wasn't just heresy, it was bad for business. Because relics meant income. A small town with a genuine thorn from Christ's crown could become a pilgrimage site overnight. Inns filled, taverns flourished, priests offered blessings, confessions, and candle-lit vigils for a fee. It was faith and economy rolled into one holy hustle, but with demand came fraud. Relic sellers, some legitimate, many not, traveled with wagons full of dubious treasures. Teeth of saints that looked suspiciously like dog molars, bottled blood that never dried. Pieces of the cross so numerous, someone joked that you could rebuild Noah's Ark. People bought them anyway, because belief, in those days, wasn't about proof. It was about need. When your crops failed, when the plague crept into town, when your child coughed through the night, you didn't need logic, you needed hope. And hope came in the shape of a dusty bone behind glass. Not everyone approved. Some clergy spoke out quietly about the overabundance of relics, about the forgeries. But the church, for the most part, let it continue. Relics were tools of devotion. And even a fake, if it inspired real faith, was better than nothing at all. So pilgrims kept walking. Coins kept clinking. And the relics, real, fake, or somewhere in between, continued to glow in candlelight, promising miracles in a world that desperately needed them. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was never safe. It was painful, perilous, and soaked in prayer. But there was one time of day that made it even worse, the hour just before dawn, often called the devil's hour. It was believed to be when spirits moved freely, when demons walked the earth, and when the soul was most vulnerable. If a woman gave birth during this time, the room didn't just fill with midwives, it filled with fear. The devil's hour, usually between 3 and 4 a.m., was thought to be a twisted mirror of Christ's death at 3 p.m. If Christ died in the light of day, the devil ruled in the depth of night. Witches, spirits, and demons were said to be strongest in those hours. The veil between worlds thinned, prayers faltered, protection weakened. And if a baby was born then, it might not be just a baby. Midwives came prepared. Candles were blessed before being lit. Iron tools were placed under the bed to keep evil away. Psalms were whispered between contractions. Doors were sealed with ash. Windows blocked with herbs. No one left the room. No one entered. The child's first cry might bring life or invite something else. If the labor went long, and the child's head crowned during that hour, The tension in the room was suffocating. Every shadow became a threat. Every creak of the floorboards was something more. If the child was born silent, people feared a changeling, a spirit's trick, swapped in the womb, lifeless or cursed. If the baby laughed, it was worse. Laughter from a newborn before the first day was done was considered unnatural. Baptism was rushed. Water was sometimes brought directly into the birthing room. A priest might be fetched before the mother even held the child. Because if the baby died unbaptized during that hour, its soul was believed to linger, restless and unreachable. Purgatory was a mercy. What came during the devil's hour was not. And what of the mother? She was seen as between worlds herself, her body open, her soul exposed. She was often given charms to hold during labor. Prayers were said over her belly, and if she fell unconscious during the devil's hour, it was feared the devil had come to claim her. Some midwives whispered that women who died in childbirth during that time became something else, not quite spirit, not quite gone, a warning, a shadow. So, when a woman felt the first pangs of labor after midnight, there was no celebration, just urgency, just ritual, just fear. Because time in the Middle Ages wasn't just a number on the wall, it was a door, and some doors only opened once. No place felt more cursed, more uncertain, or more haunted than the crossroads, those simple intersections of two dirt roads where paths crossed and destinies blurred. To us, it's just a location. To them, it was a spiritual fault line, a place where worlds touched, where rules faltered, and where souls, if they weren't careful, could vanish forever. Crossroads were believed to be thin places, liminal spaces that didn't fully belong to this world or the next. Here, spirits wandered. Witches cast their spells and demons waited with patience that only the damned could afford. Travelers avoided them at night. Even during the day, people crossed them quickly without speaking, without looking too long in any direction. And yet, they were everywhere. In villages, crossroads became a dumping ground for the unwanted dead. Suicides, executed criminals, and excommunicates were often buried there, denied church burial, and cast out to the margins of spiritual geography. Why? Because the crossroads confused spirits. It was believed that souls buried at such places couldn't find their way back. They'd be trapped, forever turning in circles, unable to haunt the living or rise on Judgment Day. Of course, that didn't stop the hauntings. People spoke of ghostly figures standing at crossroads, silent and still, of voices calling your name from the trees, of travelers who vanished between turns, last seen walking toward that cursed intersection. And if you saw a black dog there, large, silent, eyes glowing, you turned back. That wasn't a dog. That was a guardian, or worse, a collector. Crossroads were also places of summoning. In folklore, those who wanted to bargain with dark forces to gain power, wealth, forbidden knowledge, would go there, usually alone. At midnight, they'd draw symbols in the dirt, bury something of their own, a lock of hair, a tooth, a piece of parchment with their name. Then they'd wait. What came wasn't always visible, but they claimed to hear whispers, feel hands where no hands should be. If the deal was accepted, the person left changed. If it wasn't, they might not leave at all. Even mundane behaviors had their rituals. If you dropped something at a crossroads, you didn't pick it up. It was a test. Spirits were said to leave tokens, shiny coins, perfect apples, rings. Touching them meant inviting something into your life, and it would not ask permission again. So crossroads were avoided, feared, and strangely respected. They were the borderlands, not quite sacred, not entirely profane, just dangerous, just waiting. Because when every path is uncertain and every direction feels like the wrong one, the only thing you know for sure is this: You don't linger at the crossroads. You keep walking, and you don't look back. Crows weren't just birds in the Middle Ages. They were omens on wings, harbingers of death, messengers of the dark, watchers from the unseen realm. Every flap of their wing, every tilt of their beady eyes was seen as a whisper from beyond. To see one was rarely good. To see many, something terrible was coming. People didn't just notice crows, they watched them. Carefully, because it was believed that crows could see what humans couldn't. They could sense spirits, they could smell death before it arrived. Some said they circled homes where someone was about to die. Others claimed they perched outside windows, watching the soul leave a body as if waiting to carry it off. Their black feathers were a symbol of mourning. Their calls, harsh, sharp, and unsettling, were said to mimic the cries of the damned. If a crow cawed 3 times before noon, someone nearby would be dead by nightfall. If one landed on your roof, you were marked. If 2 followed you down the road, you were being measured, your time on earth weighed, counted, dwindling. But the worst belief was this: crows didn't just bring news of death. They caused it, or more accurately, they reported it. To someone. Somewhere. In many parts of Europe, it was thought that crows worked for witches, demons, and death itself. They were the eyes in the sky, the spies of the supernatural. Witches were said to send them out to gather information. If you spoke ill of someone and a crow landed nearby, it was believed the bird had been listening and would carry your words to someone who knew how to make them hurt. Crows near a newborn's home were especially feared. They were believed to be measuring the child's soul. Some midwives would wave iron tools in the air or scatter herbs to drive them off, whispering charms to protect the baby from being named by the bird. It wasn't just folklore. These beliefs made their way into daily life. Farmers might halt work if too many crows gathered. A funeral procession that passed under a cawing flock was considered cursed. Some people fed crows to stay in their favor. Others threw stones to drive them away, but always quickly, nervously, as if they knew the birds were watching. And they were. Always perched, always present, waiting. So when the sky darkened with wings and a dozen sharp beaks turned your way, people didn't just fear the birds. They feared what was listening through them. In a time when medicine was more guesswork than science and illness was seen as punishment from God, the village herbalist was both savior and suspect. Her hut smelled of sage and thyme. Her shelves held bundles of drying roots, vials of dark liquids, and pouches of strange powders. To some, she was a healer. To others, she was a witch in disguise. And often, she was both. Herbal medicine was all the people had. Willow bark for fever, nettle for pain, rue for protection, yarrow for blood. These weren't just remedies, they were spells disguised as treatments. Because in the medieval mind, the boundary between healing and sorcery was thin. A woman who could stop a cough might also be able to cause one. And that made her dangerous. Midwives, wise women, and herbalists knew their craft. They knew which plants to pick at dusk, which to burn at sunrise, which required a prayer before plucking. It was a knowledge passed down quietly, often from mother to daughter, outside of books, outside of the church, and that secrecy only added to the suspicion. If someone was cured, wonderful, but if they weren't, if they died, or worse, if they healed too fast, whispers began. She must have caused the illness in the first place. If she can end a fever with one tea, maybe she started it with another. People wanted cures but feared the price. A charm for safe childbirth, a brew for sleep, a poultice for swelling, all fine until something went wrong. A bad harvest, a sudden death, a child born sick, and suddenly the healer who once saved you became the one you pointed at. The church walked a complicated line. Some clergy accepted herbal remedies, as long as they were accompanied by prayers and blessings. Others condemned the practice outright. The difference between saintly healing and sinful magic often came down to who was watching. A monk with a salve made from lavender was praised. A peasant woman with the same salve might be accused of witchcraft. Herbs used in rituals only deepened the fear. Mandrake root, shaped like a human body, was said to scream when pulled from the ground. Belladonna could cause visions. Henbane induced sleep or death, depending on the dose. Using these plants wasn't just medicine, it was power. Power that didn't answer to priests or lords, power that came from the earth itself. And in the medieval world, unchecked power was always suspect. So herbalists walked a narrow path. They healed quietly, worked discreetly, and prayed that their potions would bring health, not attention. Because the same hands that accepted a remedy today might light a torch tomorrow. Bread wasn't just food, it was sacred, the backbone of every meal, the symbol of life, and, in the eyes of the church, the very body of Christ. To waste it was sinful, to misuse it was dangerous, and to break it the wrong way, that was an omen, one too serious to ignore. Bread was treated with reverence. Before each loaf was sliced or torn, many households made the sign of the cross over it. This wasn't just piety, it was protection. Bread had to be respected. If it fell to the floor, it was kissed before being returned to the table. If it was burned in the oven, it was buried, not thrown out, because scorched bread was thought to carry misfortune. But it was the act of breaking bread that carried the most weight. Bread broken unevenly, or with jagged edges, was said to predict family conflict. A loaf that crumbled into too many pieces meant a soul in the house was fractured, spiritually or mentally. And if you tore a piece of bread and it split down the center without resistance, someone you loved might soon be torn from you. Superstitions tied bread to death in more than one way. In some areas, it was believed that if a loaf cracked open as it baked, someone in the village would die. Others believed that the presence of holes or air pockets inside the loaf meant that death had passed nearby. The bigger the hole, the closer the presence. During funeral feasts, bread was passed solemnly, each person taking care not to break it too harshly. The loaf was torn with slow, deliberate motions, and always passed to the left, the side of mourning. A careless break during such a meal was enough to make old women fall silent, their eyes cast downward, praying the bad luck wouldn't take hold. And then there was the curse of unfinished bread. Leaving a crust uneaten, throwing away stale pieces, or cutting from the wrong end of a loaf, all were said to offend the spirits that protected the home. Some believed that if you wasted bread, your harvest would fail. Others whispered that rats would come. Not ordinary rats, but spirit rats, omens in fur, drawn to your table by the insult. Bread was even used in rituals. If a child was ill, a slice of bread might be passed over their body and then fed to a dog. If the dog rejected it, the illness was spiritual. If it ate, the child would recover. Some healers baked charms into loaves, others used stale bread as a tool to draw out sin. And yet, if that bread broke wrong, the ritual was ruined. So each meal was approached with care, each loaf with quiet respect. Because in a world where the sacred and the ordinary were always intertwined, bread wasn't just sustenance. It was a soul in your hands. Not every illness had a name. Not every ache had an explanation. Some diseases were real, infections, fevers, wounds that wouldn't heal, but others were whispered about, feared, and diagnosed only by superstition. These were the phantom diseases. conditions that didn't come from germs, but from curses, spirits, or the devil himself. You couldn't see them. Doctors, if you could even call them that, couldn't find them. But everyone knew when they were there. Take elf shot, for example. A sudden sharp pain in the side, a limb that went numb, or a person who dropped mid-step and couldn't stand again. Not illness, not injury. Shot by invisible arrows from angry fae or witches. The cure? Burn herbs, chant prayers, bury a toad under the threshold, and hope it didn't return. Or soul sickness, an affliction with no fever, no wounds, but a heavy, crushing weight. The victim stopped eating, stopped speaking, looked hollow. It wasn't depression, not in medieval terms. It was believed their soul had left the body, not fully dead, not fully alive, just missing. Sometimes it was thought to be wandering, sometimes stolen, sometimes lost in a dream it couldn't wake from. Wasting illness was another, a slow, unstoppable decline. Thinness, coughing, weakness. Maybe it was tuberculosis, maybe something else. But in many villages it wasn't disease at all. It was a hex. Or worse, a spirit feeding on the person each night. Some believed these were night devourers. Demons who slipped in as you slept, drinking your strength until you vanished entirely. And then there were possession illnesses. Fits, screaming, foaming at the mouth. Sudden outbursts, unnatural strength, strange voices. Madness, yes, but in the eyes of the church, often something darker. If the body was no longer acting human, it had likely been claimed by something inhuman. The answer? Exorcism, fasting, holy water. Or, if that failed, isolation, and eventually burial in unconsecrated ground. What made these phantom illnesses terrifying wasn't just the suffering. It was the uncertainty. They came without warning. They struck without pattern. They ignored medicine. And because no one understood them, everyone feared they might be next. Villages kept unofficial lists, things you didn't say, places you didn't go, people you didn't look at for too long. All in the hope of keeping these strange afflictions at bay. And if someone in your house fell ill in one of these strange, unexplainable ways, you didn't just call for the healer. You called for the priest, the midwife, the herbalist, anyone who might know what the signs meant. Because once a phantom illness entered a home, it rarely left quietly. Your enemies weren't always human. They weren't always visible. Illness, demons, witches, wandering spirits. The world was full of forces that didn't fight with swords, but with breath, whispers, and shadows. And to defend yourself, you needed armor, not chainmail, not a shield. Something more personal, something invisible. You needed holy protection, garlic, amulets, relics, charms stitched into your clothes. A sacred defense for a very unclean world. Garlic was one of the most famous and feared protectors. Not because it tasted strong, but because it was strong. Spiritually. People hung braids of garlic over their doors to ward off evil spirits. Wore cloves on strings around their necks. Rubbed crushed bulbs on doorways, cradles, and even foreheads during plague years. Garlic wasn't just a kitchen staple, it was demon repellent. Then there were amulets. Every village had their variations. Teeth from animals, bits of knotted string, carved stones, even fragments of scripture hidden in tiny pouches, worn under clothes, tucked into boots, or hung from belts. These weren't decorations, they were lifelines. Children were especially protected. Newborns might have little cloth bags pinned to their gowns, filled with salt, sage, and sometimes a fingernail or hair from a living parent, to tie their soul to the world. Babies were vulnerable, soft between life and death. Their defenses had to be physical, spiritual, and constant. Some amulets were tailored to specific threats: fear of witches, carry iron or rowan wood, afraid of night spirits, wear a moonstone or hang bells by the window, headed to battle or a faraway market. Sew a scrap of holy cloth into your tunic and say a prayer before leaving. There were even protective drinks, holy water mixed with ash or ground herbs, taken like medicine. Not to heal the body, but to armor the soul. And if none of those worked, people turned to relics: a sliver of a saint's bone, a drop of holy oil, a feather from a pilgrimage shrine. These were the premium defense tools. If you had access to one, you kept it close. Pilgrims sometimes carried tiny reliquaries around their necks, boxes shaped like hearts or crosses, pressed to the skin like armor. But these tools weren't casual, they were sacred. Misusing them could backfire. Wearing an amulet without proper blessing? You might invite the very thing you were trying to repel. Placing garlic too near the hearth? That could call spirits instead of chasing them. The logic didn't have to make sense. It had to feel right. Because in the end, the world was a battlefield of unseen wars. You couldn't fight a plague with prayer alone. You couldn't argue with a curse. You had to protect yourself however you could, with salt in your pocket, ash under your tongue, and a clove of garlic swinging quietly on a string. Not because it made you invincible, but because it might be just enough. Death didn't just take the body, it unsettled everything. The house, the air, the objects within. And one object in particular was considered especially dangerous during death's visit: the mirror. Reflective surfaces, even those as dim as polished bronze or water-filled basins, were believed to become portals the moment someone in the home passed away. To leave them uncovered was to risk trapping the soul. So when death came, mirrors were veiled. Always. The moment someone breathed their last, family members, often with trembling hands, covered every reflective surface in the house with cloth, herbs, or dark veils. Not doing so wasn't just careless, it was spiritual negligence. The belief was that a soul, in its confusion after death, might see itself in the mirror and get stuck, unable to move on. Worse, it might become frightened by its reflection, not recognizing the image and spiral into unrest. A confused soul could turn bitter. It might stay, it might haunt. Some feared that death itself, still lingering in the room, might use mirrors to enter or exit. Mirrors were seen as windows between worlds, and during a death, the boundary between life and the beyond was already thin. A mirror left open was a door left unlocked. There were darker fears, too, that if the living looked into a mirror in a room with the dead, they might see something they shouldn't. Not themselves, but the deceased. Or worse, the next person to die. Rumors abounded of people who glimpsed unfamiliar faces in the glass after a relative died, and didn't live long enough to explain what they saw. So mirrors were covered until the body was buried, sometimes longer. Cloth was usually black, but not always. In poor homes, any scrap of fabric would do, even straw mats or bits of old curtain. Wealthier families had special mourning veils just for this purpose. Even water was treated cautiously. In some places, buckets were overturned or hidden. Basins were emptied. A still pool of water was too much like a mirror, too much like a place where the soul could linger, lost and reflecting. Once the funeral passed and the house was purified, usually by incense, herbs, or prayers, the mirrors were uncovered. Sometimes cautiously, sometimes not at all. Some people couldn't bear to look again, for fear the mirror remembered. Because in a world without cameras or screens, the mirror was still one of the few places you could look and see yourself. And during death, it might just show you something else entirely. Funerals were more than rituals of mourning. They were acts of spiritual navigation. you weren't just saying goodbye to the dead, you were guiding them home. And music? Music was the compass, a sacred language that bridged heaven and earth. But sing the wrong words, strike the wrong note, chant the wrong psalm, and you might not send the soul away, you might call it back. Funeral songs were chosen carefully. Gregorian chants, Latin hymns, psalm verses that promised peace, mercy, eternal rest. Each had a purpose: to soothe the soul, to warn demons off, to assure the living that the dead were no longer among them. But in a world where few could read, where most music was passed down by ear, mistakes happened. A wrong line, a misremembered refrain, a melody borrowed from the wrong tradition. And suddenly, the song meant something else. To sing the wrong funeral song was to confuse the soul. Instead of guiding it forward, the music could call it back to the body. Or worse, leave it stranded, hovering in the liminal space between life and death, where no priest could reach it. People told stories of such funerals: candles that refused to stay lit, bells that rang at the wrong time, the sound of footsteps in the church long after the mourners had left. In some regions, only certain people were allowed to sing funeral songs. Death chanters, they were called. Trained by clergy, steeped in liturgy, and often chosen because they'd sung without error for years. In times of plague, these singers became sacred instruments. They walked between cottages, their voices trembling through windows. No ceremony, just a voice in the mist, a soul guide. But not everyone had access to them. Poor villages relied on memory, on half-remembered hymns and folk songs woven with superstition. Some sang in Latin they didn't understand. Others used local chants passed down by grandmothers who mixed church with old pagan rites. The result was a haunting patchwork, beautiful, eerie, and sometimes dangerously wrong. There were whispered tales of the dead rising, not as corpses, but as presences. Spirits drawn back by the songs meant to send them away. A boy who sang a farewell to his brother in the wrong key, only to hear that same melody whistled outside his window at night. A widow who added a verse from an old love song to her husband's dirge and swore she felt him lying beside her for weeks after. So the lesson was clear. Words mattered. Notes mattered. The melody you sent into the air would echo beyond the church walls, and if the song faltered, if the soul lost its path, it might come back looking for you to finish it. Dying wasn't just about the body failing. It was about the soul finishing its last piece of business. Because if you died with unspoken sins or unfinished oaths, the grave wouldn't hold you. You'd be back. Not as a horror, not always, but as a burden, a whisper, a warning. And so came the ritual of the deathbed confession, the most sacred, most feared conversation a person would ever have. As death approached, the priest was summoned. No matter the hour, no matter the weather. He came with oil, water, cross, and questions. Not to comfort, and not at first, but to cleanse. The dying had to speak. Every sin, every lie, every broken vow. Because what you took with you, unspoken, you carried into the grave like chains. And if you died without confessing, or worse, if you refused, you risked more than hell. You risked unrest. People told of spirits who wandered because they died without absolution. A soldier who never confessed his battlefield cruelty, seen walking the hills at dusk. A widow who swore never to reveal her secret lover, her sobbing heard through the chimney for years. These weren't monsters. These were people with open contracts, deals left unfinished, words unspoken, souls too heavy to rise. But confession wasn't always enough. If you'd made a vow in life, a contract with another, it had to be settled. A debt owed, a promise made on a parent's grave, a wedding vow broken in secret. These were spiritual bindings, and if the dying remembered them too late, the priest might write it down or pass it on, because if the vow wasn't fulfilled in life, it would become haunted. Ghosts didn't always linger because of murder or revenge. Sometimes they came back because someone promised to light a candle every feast day and didn't, or because a dying man swore to repay a borrowed coin and never did. Small things by modern standards, but to the medieval soul, a vow was a living thing. To break it was to wound the world. So bedside confessions were tense, sacred, terrifying. Families waited in silence. Eyes watched doors and windows, afraid of what might already be listening. Sometimes the dying spoke gently. Other times they screamed. Names, secrets, confessions so heavy they cracked the silence in two. Some priests wept, some refused to repeat what they'd heard. And when the final breath came, the hope was this. The soul was lighter. The path was clear. No footprints would circle the house, no shadows would pass over the candle, no voices would call out from under the floorboards. But if they did, someone had broken the contract. The Middle Ages were not kind. Life was short, brutal, and filled with mystery. Every shadow had meaning. Every sound in the night, every cracked loaf of bread, every owl on a rooftop, a message, a warning, a threat. You weren't just living in the world. You were tiptoeing through a battlefield of invisible forces. And superstition? That was your armor. Survival didn't come from brute strength or noble birth alone. It came from knowing the rules. Not the ones written in law books, but the ones whispered by candlelight, passed down from mothers to children, from dying priests to curious altar boys, from toothless crones to frightened brides. The rules that said, don't sweep at night, don't sleep facing north, don't let the wind touch your baby, don't name your child too soon, don't leave your shoes on the table. These weren't just habits. They were lifelines. The church tried to control it. The nobility tried to ignore it. But the people, the villagers, the midwives, the blacksmiths, the shepherds, believed, because belief made the world make sense. And when nothing else could protect you from plague, famine, war, and death, belief was all you had left. You prayed with one hand and clutched a charm with the other. You went to Mass on Sunday but salted your doorway just in case. You confessed your sins but still buried the burned loaf under the tree. Superstition didn't oppose faith. It stood beside it. A second layer of protection against a world so dark, so uncertain, that even the brightest candle couldn't keep the shadows back forever. And maybe that's what made the Middle Ages so strange, so haunting, so human. The sheer need to control what could not be controlled. To find pattern in the chaos. To believe that a string of garlic, a pinch of grave dirt, a murmured phrase at the right moment could mean the difference between life and death. Between being forgotten and surviving. So when someone lived to 40, when a woman gave birth without dying, when a winter passed without disease or famine, it wasn't luck, it was victory. 1,000 invisible battles won, a web of rituals held together by hope, fear, and stubborn human will. And now, as you sit in the safety of the modern world, surrounded by logic and reason and science, it's easy to laugh at the superstitions of the past. But next time you hesitate before walking under a ladder, or knock on wood, or hold your breath passing a graveyard, just remember, the Middle Ages never left us completely. They're just sleeping under the floorboards, waiting to rise with the next whisper in the dark.